or to research upon an alternative way to see development and set an agenda for an alternative economics to address the developmental question of both the country and the world. Next, may I request Professor M.A. to formally inaugurate the IUCAE and the seminar by releasing the book of abstract. And I also request Professor Prabhakar Patnaik to receive the copy of the abstract. And I also request Professor Prabhakar Patnaik to receive the copy of the abstract. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Next is the most awaited lecture of the day, the keynote address of Professor Prabhakar Patnaik, Emeritus Professor J. It is with great pleasure that we invite you for the keynote address.
Professor M.A. Professor A.K. Prasad, Professor Abdul Salim, Professor Radhamani, Professor Manju Nair, my young friends Siddiq Rabiat, participants at this international conference. First of all, I'm sure that after the very learned lecture of Professor M.A., for you to have another lecture would be taxing. I ask forgiveness for it because I have been asked by the organizers to do this, and I cannot say no to them because I'm a part of the organizing committee itself. As a matter of fact, I sat through, I saw this seminar before it had happened. I sat through the planning sessions of the seminar, and I've been in correspondence with the organizers from time to time. And when they asked me to come, obviously, being as it were a part of the family itself, I could not say no. And I certainly therefore also cannot say no to the fact of following upon Professor M.A.'s very learned lecture, which requires a lot of thinking on the part of everybody. The topic which I chose to speak on is globalization and the assault on democracy. Now, obviously, these days, if you have anything to do with JNU, which I do, then this is a topic which actually comes first to your mind. What exactly is happening in our country, the like of which I must say I have not seen in all my life, not even during the emergency of 1975-77. But then when you think of it, this is not something which is unique to our country or unique to JNU, but it's something which is happening in many parts of the world. In many parts of the world, forces which are either fundamentalist or fascist or semi-fascist or extreme right-wing forces, very different from the usual conservative parties which have been in operation for a very long time, are acquiring ascendancy with the idea of dividing the people, terrorizing the minorities, be they a religious minority, be they an ethnic minority, and thereby undermining democracy, not in the sense necessarily that elections disappear or democratic institutions cease to function, but basically the concept of a fraternity of equal citizens which underlies democracy is negated. Now this is something which is happening everywhere. It is also happening here, and this actually poses a problem. The problem is the following, that we all think of capitalism as something which ushers in democracy. We think of capitalism as a progressive force, a force for modernity, and democracy is a part of the modern setup. And that being the case, we would have thought that unrestrained capitalism, the less restrained it is, the less it is, as it were, hemmed in by feudal and semi-feudal integuments, the more it should be able to be proposed, to be, as it were, pushing and developing and promoting democratic ethos and democratic institutions. Now, globalization certainly is a state of affairs in which capitalism is not very hemmed in, because the whole point of globalization is that it is actually capital unleashed on the global scale. If that is the case, I mean, earlier, for instance, people used to talk about a quota license permit Raj, but now you have, as it were, an economic regime that more or less promotes the development of capitalism. So the question therefore arises that how come that in the very era where you have capitalism being unleashed, unrestrained capitalism being unleashed in the world, you actually have not the development of democracy, but on the contrary, the development of forces which are, in a sense, obviously inimical to democracy, whether or not they succeed in actually negating the formal institutions of it. In some places they may, but in other places they would not. And obviously, for instance, in America, Donald Trump's election, which is being looked upon with great fear and awe by everybody, is something which is really pitting one segment of the people against another, particularly the minorities and so on, and this is something which terrifies everybody, even though Trump may come to power, if he does, on the basis of the functioning of democratic institutions. But his coming to power itself would in some sense have negated some basic aspects of democracy. So the question arises, how do we understand this paradox? This paradox, in my view, is linked to another phenomenon which also may appear paradoxical, or which is again a feature of capitalism which is not recognized. In fact, when Professor Emeritus was giving his speech, I felt that this is one of the features which development economics, for instance, does not recognize. And that feature is the following, that typically it is believed that capitalism, of course, destroys pre-capitalist formations of various kinds. It undermines petty production, it undermines peasant agriculture, it undermines fishermen, craftsmen, and people of pre-capitalist production organizations. But at the same time, it is always believed that those who are displaced by such undermining then tend to get absorbed into capitalism as a part of the proletariat. Therefore, it may be doing this undermining, which of course may be transitionally quite painful, but on the other hand, ultimately, since they get absorbed, they, if not they, then their progeny get absorbed into the proletariat. This transitional pain is something which is just a price that society pays for developing the productive forces to higher and higher levels. That the pain is only a transitional one. As a matter of fact, my teacher, Amartya Sen, whom Professor Uman quoted, actually had once said, in the context of the problems which had arisen in West Bengal and in the left front regime on issues like Singur and so on, that listen, London and Manchester, when they were built, peasants were displaced. So the point is that why are we, the implicit thing was that these things happen as a part of history, but this is something which is not necessarily a matter to get very worried about because of the fact that these are transitional pains. Transitional pains can be very acute for individuals, but on the other hand, societies have to learn to take these transitional pains in their stride precisely because these pains are supposed to be transitional. Now, this is something which has been a very common theme in economics, very common theme in development economics. And the question I want to raise is that are the pains transitional? Are they actually transitional? And my answer would be no. The reason why, I said it's a very common theme in economics because it goes back to the writings of David Ricardo, again, whom Professor Uman quoted. David Ricardo had a very famous statement about the introduction of machinery. And that statement, his ultimate statement, as many of you know, that he had actually 3 different versions or his views on machinery underwent a change, and finally he developed a view which has really come down in economics, if not explicitly, at least implicitly, as a very important proposition, and that's the following. Machinery introduces unemployment. Without a doubt, because obviously if you have, for instance, automatic looms which replace hand looms or even power looms, then there will be unemployment. But what happens is that with machinery, the rate of profit increases compared to what it was earlier, which is why after all it does displace them. If the rate of profit was lower, it won't even be introduced. It gets introduced precisely because the rate of profit in introducing machinery is higher than the rate of profit that prevailed earlier. Now, insofar as profits typically tend to be saved and invested, this rate of profit being higher implies that the rate of accumulation also becomes higher. So if the rate of accumulation becomes higher, that means the capital stock grows faster. That also means that output would be growing faster and employment would be growing faster. So the argument is that the introduction of machinery introduces unemployment for a while, but then introduces a rate of growth of employment that is faster than was the case earlier. As a result, after a certain number of periods, you would find not only has this original unemployment generated by machinery been fully absorbed, but as a matter of fact, the rate of growth of employment from that point onwards will be even faster than would have been in the absence of machinery. This is Ricardo's famous proposition. I don't know if you do choice of techniques and so on. When I was a student, we used to do that. Amartya Sen's book, Choice of Techniques and so on. The same argument is carried forward, that more labor-intensive techniques give you a lower rate of profit, and consequently with more labor-intensive techniques, rate of growth of employment is lower. If you have more capital-intensive techniques, even in a country which is labor-abundant, in that case, precisely because the rate of profit and the rate of accumulation and therefore the rate of growth of output, capital stock, output, employment, everything is higher, over a period of time, if you have a sufficiently large time horizon, then even a labor-abundant country should be using capital-intensive techniques. This is actually an idea taken over completely from David Ricardo. Now, the point is that this proposition of Ricardo is fundamentally a proposition which underlies a great deal of thinking even today on development economics. When people talk about the fact that, look, it doesn't matter if we have, for instance, the displacement of, let's say, peasants and so on, because this displacement ultimately is going to give rise to a kind of technological progress, and with it a kind of higher growth rate, including of employment, whereby all the displaced would get absorbed. Now, Ricardo's proposition, since you're all economists, let me indulge in a bit of formalism. Ricardo's proposition was based on three specific assumptions. The first assumption, which was questioned by Marx when he discussed Ricardo and machinery, is that he was talking about a one-shot. In other words, you just have one technique, you introduce machinery. But if you have a series of introduction of different techniques, that means you introduce machinery, then you introduce a better machinery tomorrow, then you introduce a still better machinery tomorrow, you introduce a still better machinery tomorrow. In that case, you have to talk not in terms of the absorption of the labor with a sufficient period of time, but the sufficient period of time gets postponed and postponed and postponed. So that's the first proposition. In fact, Hicks once referred to it, I think, as Ricardo's theory being based on a single spark. In other words, just one spark, one short introduction of machinery. The second, and Marx criticized it as well on the same grounds. The second problem with Ricardo's proposition on machinery is that, okay, I accept that a higher rate of profit implies a higher rate of savings for the economy. Typically, capitalists tend to have a higher propensity to save out of profits than workers have out of wages, and consequently, if you have a higher rate of profit, then the higher rate of profit must also, out of any given output, a higher rate of profit, higher share of profit would also mean a higher savings ratio. It follows, therefore, that is an assumption that I accept. But Ricardo's proposition meant that all savings are invested, that actually if you have a higher rate of savings, automatically you have a higher rate of growth. Now that implies assuming his Say's law. That implies assuming that all savings are automatically invested. If you say all savings are invested, then basically you're ignoring all problems of aggregate demand. You're believing in Say's law. If you believe in Say's law, then you believe that there can never be a deficiency of aggregate demand. Capitalist economies have always had, except in periods of war, they have always had a deficiency of aggregate demand. In other words, the peak output has never been produced. It has never been produced because of the fact that there has never been adequate demand for the production of the peak output in any period. Now, that being the case, once you recognize the fact that there is a problem of aggregate demand, investment then depends on how much you expect demand to grow. Today, for instance, in the US economy and in most advanced capitalist economies, in Europe now, the European Central Bank is giving out loans to the other European commercial banks at negative rates of interest. That you actually lower the interest rate at which banks can borrow from central bank to negative levels, even so the recession continues. Why? Because businessmen are not interested in investing. Why aren't they interested in investing? Because the market is not expected to grow. And consequently, investment decisions in a demand-constrained system, in a system that actually is prone to deficiency of aggregate demand, investment decisions are taken independently. They are not taken because there is more or less savings. On the contrary, if investment is less and there is a greater propensity to save, then as Keynes said, there will be unemployment and recession, and therefore there would be a deficiency of aggregate demand. If you therefore think in terms of investment being undertaken on the basis of the expected growth of the markets, which is referred to as the accelerator mechanism and so on, then you find that the rate of growth gets detached from the savings ratio. And when that happens, then the rate of growth getting detached, the rate of growth, those who are displaced by the introduction of machinery may never get absorbed. Let me give you a very simple example. Imagine, for instance, the population in a country grows at 2%. Imagine, for instance, the rate of growth in that country is about 8%. Imagine, for instance, that because of technological progress, which is continuously raising the rate of growth of labor productivity for an 8% growth in the economy grows at 7%. In which case the rate of growth of employment is 8 minus 7, 1%. But your population and workforce is growing at 2%. So you will have a perennial increase in the magnitude of unemployment. Okay, so once you see that Say's law does not hold, once you see that investment is determined in an autonomous fashion, and once you see, therefore, that the rate of growth of investment and therefore the rate of growth of output has an autonomy, then it becomes necessarily the case that there is no reason why people who are displaced by the introduction of machinery would be absorbed at all. In fact, there is no reason why people who are petty producers who are displaced by the development of unrestrained capitalism would necessarily find jobs as a part of the new proletariat, because the proletariat may grow at a rate which is so low, even lower relative to the rate of growth of the natural workforce, that those displaced will actually simply fall by the wayside forever, in perpetuity. When that happens, then you can actually have combinations of high rates of growth on the one hand with which increases in unemployment, underemployment, and therefore poverty at the same time. Increases in labor reserves coexisting with the rise, with a fairly high growth rate of output. Now, in economies like ours, this is exactly what has been happening. You may ask a question here, which I think you must, namely that, okay, but then what happened in the advanced countries? After all, it is not as if in the advanced countries, I mean, when Amartya Sen said, when London and Manchester were built, peasants were thrown out of their lands, but then what happened to those peasants? How come that they have not lingered on as a growing reserve army of labor, as a growing mass of unemployed and underemployed persons? Well, I think there were three specific ways in which advanced capitalism overcame this problem. The first way, of course, the most significant way was massive migration from Europe to the temperate regions of white settlement. That means Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. The scale of migration was massive. From Britain, for instance, between 1815 and 1910, every year, virtually half the increase in population simply migrated. I'm not saying newborns migrated, but if you look at the numbers, half the increase in population of Britain every year over a period of a century just migrated. If you make a similar calculation for India, suppose half the population had migrated by now, since independence, I think it would have been about 36 to 40 crores which should have migrated out of India by now. Obviously, therefore, that is a possibility which no longer remains for us. We cannot actually have migration on that scale to get rid of the unemployed and the underemployed who were created by capitalism's encroachment on petty production, on pre-capitalist production. Okay. That was a major factor. They just, as you know, they went, got rid of the, Amerindians who occupied land earlier, got hold of their land and set themselves up as farmers. So the employed and the underemployed, the unemployed and the underemployed found employment in the so-called new lands, and they did so at the expense of local inhabitants by getting hold of the land which was earlier being cultivated by them. The second phenomenon, which is why capitalism in the metropolis did not get saddled with the problem I'm talking about, of course lay in the fact that quite a lot of the displacement of petty producers was not just local, it happened in colonies like India, or colonies like the West Indies, colonies elsewhere, in China, semi-colonies like China, because these were the countries where the petty producers were displaced by British textiles. When Indian weavers were thrown out of their employment because of the import of cloth from Manchester, likewise in China or elsewhere, they remained unemployed, underemployed, pauperized mass, but in places which were not visible from the metropolis. You think of Britain as having overcome its problem, but the problem it generated in the colonies never got overcome, and which is the origin, as many economic historians argue, of mass poverty in countries like ours. And the third feature, of course, is that even machinery which was originally manufactured in the 19th century and so on, in the main advanced capitalist countries, it was being manufactured for the first time, was itself highly labor intensive. And people actually use labor with some primitive tools and so on in order to produce machines. As a result, machine making itself was a highly labor intensive task. For all these reasons, advanced capitalism or metropolitan capitalism, European capitalism managed to overcome the kind of problem of unemployment and underemployment that capitalism typically generates when it throws out petty producers, pre-capitalist producers, but in ways which are not open to us. And consequently, in India, what you actually find is a substantial increase, precisely in the period in which we have had very high growth rates, 2004-5 to 9-10, let us say, that period, in very high growth rates. Really speaking, the rate of growth of employment has been minuscule. Even though, at the same time, there has been a squeeze on the peasantry, there has been a squeeze on the petty producers. Many peasants have left land and gone to the cities in search of employment, which is non-existing. Now this is something which I should warn you entails a problem. Again, John Robinson, whom Professor Omen quoted, has a very interesting illustration of the problem. During the Great Depression in Britain, a lot of people, workers who didn't have jobs, they started setting up as shoe shine persons. They would just sit somewhere and wait for people to come and shine their shoes. Now that, and the term disguised unemployment was actually coined by her to describe that phenomenon. Now you could of course say that where was the depression? There was a massive boom in the shoe shine industry. So that the fact of unemployment may get camouflaged alternatively as a massive boom in particular sectors. Many of them, because they are self-employed, nobody employed them to shine shoes, would appear as self-employed as entrepreneurs. Day before yesterday there was a news in the papers that in UP apparently there has been a massive growth of entrepreneurs and employment of that kind. Much of it, I'm sure, is really the increase in labor reserves that gets camouflaged like this. Therefore, in order to define, in other words, the definition of employment and unemployment itself requires the specification of a norm. If you take a very simple norm, let's even forget the ILO norms about what is proper employment, decent employment and so on. Our National Sample Survey asks a question, namely that what is your usual status? Do you consider your own usual status as being employed? And those who do so, I call the usual status employed. If you look at the rate of growth of usual status employment between 2004, 5 and 9, 10, at a time the economy was growing at 8% per annum apparently, you have 0.8% per annum growth in usual status employment. And obviously that is way below the rate of growth of the natural workforce, and of course those who are displaced, the petty producers who are displaced, the peasants who are displaced and who are migrated to the cities in search of jobs, and you find from census data very large numbers of peasants doing so, they remain an underemployed, unemployed, pauperized, disguised unemployed mass. And of course many of them swell the ranks of the lumpen proletariat. Now, it follows therefore that this is something which is also reflects itself. You know, it follows from what I'm saying, that globalization, which means the unleashing of unrestrained capitalism, on the one hand, undermines petty production. In the pre-globalization period, for instance, after independence, you had the Indian state in many ways protecting petty production. Not everybody was equally beneficiary out of it, but nonetheless there was an effort to set up a regime to protect petty production. Look at the peasantry, for instance. Inputs were subsidized, outputs were in fact purchased for 22 crops at any rate at assured remunerative prices. You had input subsidies extending even to credit subsidy with kind of priority sector lending targets, where there was a differential interest rate scheme where the peasants got interest at lower rates. You had a situation where agriculture was protected from world market price fluctuations, both through high tariffs as well as through quantitative restrictions. You had public sector research establishments doing research in finding new varieties of seeds, which were then disseminated through an enormously large extension service which was set up by the government. Today, you find extension services gone. Much of the seeds which the peasants use are seeds being made available by multinationals through their agents, agribusiness multinationals. You find that in a lot of the subsidies which were being offered on inputs have been virtually withdrawn. You find that interest rate subsidy in particular with lending, with priority sector lending norms being wound up. In fact, when I used to work in Kerala, I used to go to various places, and once I think I went to Kasaragod or somewhere, where the bank people themselves told me that so much has the definition of the priority sector been widened that if you purchase a scooter and you happen to live in a village, or if Coca-Cola sets up a plant in a village and borrows money from the bank, that's shown as priority sector lending. So when I had gone to a bank in Kasaragod, they told me, in the last 18 months we have not actually given a single agricultural loan. But they met their priority sector lending quotas, because of which a whole new class of money lenders has come up, which is now giving loans to the peasants at very high interest rates, usurious interest rates. So one of the hallmarks of globalization is the fact that support which the state extended earlier to petty production is withdrawn, which makes possible the encroachments of capital into the sphere of petty production and the undermining of petty production which is going on, of which of course all these peasant suicides and so on are basically reflections. This undermining of petty production is what I would call a process of primitive accumulation of capital that Marx had talked about, of capitalism destroying pre-capitalist sectors. While that is happening, one would not necessarily shed tears over it if one had, of course, a kind of historical vision, if it was the case that those who were displaced were getting absorbed as the proletariat, but they're not. And consequently, you have the development of capitalism with very high rates of output growth being accompanied by a simultaneous increase in poverty. And this comes through, and this is compounded by the withdrawal of the state even from producing basic services, providing basic services like education, health, etc., because of which, again, the cost of these services to everybody tends to go up. Because of all this, you find that high growth rate is accompanied by an increase in poverty, absolute poverty at the other end, which is often not recognized. One very easy way of checking it is to simply take the norms which the Planning Commission itself defines as constituting poverty, namely, do you have access to 2,200 calories if you live in urban India per person per day? Or do you, 2,100. If you live in rural areas, do you have access to 2,200 calories per person per day? If you just look at the number of people who have access to this, or who don't have access to this, who therefore constitute the poor, the proportion of the rural population which does not have access to 2,200 calories per person per day increased between 2004, 5 and 9, 10, the period of very high growth rate when so-called India was emerging as a so-called economic superpower, increased from around 69 to 75%, and exactly very similar parallel order of magnitude of increase in urban area with that norm. So you find that actually precisely when growth is taking place, there is an increase in poverty, and this is because the process of primitive accumulation of capital, which is unleashed by unrestrained capitalism, and which, in fact, therefore, dispossesses, displaces, or degrades petty producers, does not really absorb them into the proper capitalist proletariat, because the size of this proletariat is not actually increasing particularly rapidly. As a matter of fact, it may interest you to know that this business of degrading is so important that we once made a calculation for Kerala. And the calculation for Kerala is that suppose we actually impute the minimum wage of the state, which was given in MG, NREGS and so on, the minimum wage of the state to the fishermen sector, traditional fishermen sector. Assume that every fisherman is earning that minimum wage. Then you'll find that the sector as a whole has negative value added. I mean, in other words, the sector as a whole would actually have a situation where the input cost plus the imputed wage is higher than the value of output. Okay, which basically means that since the sector was operating, the actual return per day, return per labor day, which the fishermen were getting, was lower than the minimum wage, which was a statutory minimum wage of the state and which was being given in MG and REGS. Okay. You may ask, then why didn't they all quit fishing and go to MG and REGS? Well, one very important reason is that, quite often it's historically recognized that people in particular occupations value being in that occupation and don't easily like going elsewhere. This is something which actually had acted even in Britain as a hindrance to the formation of a proletariat, because even when you beat them down in terms of their conditions of life, nonetheless, they stick to where they were because they feel free there rather than being at the beck and call of somebody out there, rather than losing their freedom. Anyway, so the upshot is that this is a situation which we have to reckon with. As a matter of fact, I should say that the only countries in the world which actually overcame surplus labor, overcame labor reserves, used up labor reserves, were the former socialist countries. Whatever you may think of them politically and so on, their biggest critic, Janos Kornai, Hungarian economist, And this is a well-known fact, they actually were labor shortage economies. And the reason they were labor shortage economies is because of the fact that they also tended to control the pace of technological change. In other words, suppose I gave you an example, you're growing at 8%, the rate of growth of output is 8%, if the rate of growth of labor productivity is 7%, then the rate of growth of employment would be 1%. But suppose you actually control the rate of growth of labor productivity. Don't allow unrestrained technological change, which by the way is what Gandhiji had suggested. In that case, you'll actually be able to have, even with 8% growth rate, you may have a 1, 2, 3% rate of growth of labor productivity, in which case your rate of growth of output would be kind of 5-6%. Sorry, employment would be 5-6%, and you'll be able to use up the labor reserves. So, the point is that therefore unrestrained capitalism, such as during the era of globalization, has the effect of producing, along with wealth at one pole, growing absolute poverty at the other. The kind of thing that Professor Ruben was referring to when he discussed Piketty is something which we actually find, because you find that the labor reserves do not get absorbed. Just picture a world. Labor reserves are large. When labor reserves are large, real wages maybe are somewhere close to subsistence. When real wages are close to subsistence, labor productivity is increasing, therefore the share of surplus is increasing. But when the share of surplus increases, more income comes to well-off people. Well-off people tend to buy all kinds of goods which are not particularly labor-intensive. They would try to buy goods, let's say, which are, kind of, prevalent according to the tastes and so on in the United States or elsewhere, which are not very labor-intensive. And if that is the case, then you'd find that that tends to perpetuate itself, because then the growth of labor productivity tends to be higher. No matter how high the growth rate, these labor reserves never get used up. Now, if this is the state of affairs, in that case, obviously, with growing poverty, growing unemployment, underemployment, and so on one side, even as wealth is increasing on the other side, how does this become compatible with a democratic setup? Maybe for some time it may. You can give promise to people, yes, the growth is going to trickle down to you, development would trickle down, benefits of development would trickle down. But sooner or later, people begin to tire of those promises. And then the question arises, how is it that you can manage within a democratic polity to accommodate a pattern of economic growth which is fundamentally, in a very basic sense, inequalizing? How can the notion of a fraternity of equal citizens be compatible with a situation where some people are doing remarkably well and others are sinking increasingly into poverty? There are various mechanisms which are used for it. Two of them are pretty straightforward. One of them, of course, is the fact that once you are locked into the process of globalization, where there is a freedom of capital to flow in and out. Okay, for instance, in India, we now have a situation where FIIs, foreign institutional investors, can bring in funds, take it out. If capital can flow in and out, in that case, any government which tends to have an agenda different from what finance wants is one that will trigger a capital flight. And this very fear prevents people from having any agenda different from what capital wants. Therefore, no matter which political party comes to power, they all promise to do the same things. And consequently, that way, the whole point of democracy, which must be a choice between alternative agendas, really tends to get scuttled. Anyway, that happens anyway. The second thing that happens, a kind of automatic mechanism, is that if you have these growing labor reserves, and therefore informalization of production, which is a symptom of this, then a lot of organizations like trade unions become weaker. In other words, the capacity of the people to resist then tends to go down, and that being the case, obviously you do have a kind of spontaneous weakening of democracy. But a third and very important feature which comes to the forefront in this era is really an ideological effort to pit people of one group against another. And that is something which becomes a very common feature in this era. And this becomes even more significant in periods of crisis like now, because not only the world capitalist economy is in a crisis, but this crisis is now beginning to affect economies like ours. Growth rate is going down. Exports have gone down for the last 12 months. Exports are continuously decreasing. If the economy still manages to have its nose above the water, it's only because oil prices have fallen, and that is a political decision taken within the OPEC under American pressure by Saudi Arabia and so on. But the point is that if oil prices had not fallen, if oil prices had remained where they were, our economy would be in a very deep crisis. Now, this kind of a crisis also means that even those who are beneficiaries of globalization, the upper middle class and so on, for whom some employment opportunities got opened up, even they start feeling the pinch of the crisis. And in situations like this, it becomes particularly relevant, it becomes particularly, historically, the context in which divisive ideologies, fascistic ideologies, quasi-fascistic ideologies, ideologies that basically pit one segment of the people against another, they begin to acquire currency. This is exactly what had happened in Germany in the 1930s, or all over the world in the 1930s, and this is something which you are beginning to see all over, including in Europe itself, because racialism somewhere, communalism somewhere else, like in our country, these then come to the forefront in order to mobilize people along lines where basically, in some sense, which are different from their economic predicament. As a matter of fact, Chomsky makes a very interesting point about the United States. He says that the Republican Party has increasingly become now a party that defends corporate interests. But the Republican Party does not defend corporate interests anymore by saying we are defending corporate interests. It defends corporate interests, and when it goes to the people to vote, it does so in the name of opposing the gays, in the name of opposing the lesbians, in the name of defending, let's say, whatever religious, Christianity, in the name of opposing Darwin's theory and things of that kind. In other words, you mobilize people along very basic Christian fundamentalist lines, but on the other hand, you do so that once having got their votes, then you would be actually carrying out a pro-corporate agenda. So you actually, and some, this is not to say that the corporates necessarily connive in this, they may do so, but in fact it may even get out of their hands in certain periods, but a kind of corporate fundamentalist axis or a corporate communal axis is something that does tend to get developed in periods like this, particularly when the system is engulfed in crisis. And this is a phenomenon that we are seeing all over the world to some extent happening, and this is a phenomenon we also see in countries like ours. This, of course, would have very serious consequences for democracy, for civil liberties, for freedom of expression, for creativity, for academic freedom, and so on, which, of course, all of us are extremely worried about. But I believe, and this is where I'm going to end, I believe that, this is also the time for us to think in terms of an alternative agenda. I think a lot of people in India, well-meaning people, had pinned their hopes that, look, we have a feudal society, we have a reactionary society, we have a patriarchal society, that in some sense globalization represents an advance. In fact, I have often heard people telling me, you economists, you just talk against globalization, but look, it is a progressive phenomenon in our country. Now, what I'd like to say is that is a myth. The fact that capitalism did bring about certain very basic changes in Europe was not innate to capitalism, is because of the conjuncture of that time in which all these historic possibilities were available, which no longer are. And consequently, to think of globalization as a progressive phenomenon per se is erroneous. On the contrary, what we do find, particularly as the system gets into a crisis, is globalization, the corporate financial oligarchy, which is the driving force behind globalization, making alliances of all kinds, implicit or explicit, with very reactionary elements in society in order to keep the system going, which, even though it may not formally jettison democracy, works informally to undermine it. I think it is in this context that I think we really have to think in terms of an alternative agenda outside of globalization, and since the seminar is about development, an alternative development agenda. This development agenda, in my view, must carry forward the promise of the anti-colonial struggle. The promise of the anti-colonial struggle, which was, for instance, embodied in the Karachi Congress resolution of 1931, which actually promised universal adult franchise, compulsory and free primary education. It actually set out an agenda of what free India would be like. Equality before law, the state would have no religion, equality before law and equal rights for men and women, etc. I think that agenda has to be carried forward by adding to it a set of economic rights. In our constitution, in fact, the economic rights were put into the fundamental principles, while the political rights were enshrined in the basic, in the fundamental rights of the constitution. I think we should carry forward, we should actually insist on a set of justiciable, universal economic rights for everybody. And these economic rights must be, in my view, a right to food, a right to employment, a right to old age pension and disability benefits, a right to quality education in state-funded institutions for everybody, and of course a right to free health services, free health care again state-funded like in the National Health Service. All of these the country can well afford. It wouldn't cost more than 10% of our GDP, which is something which can be very easily acquired. We have a tax GDP ratio of 14%. If that gets raised to 24%, we would be about the same level as the United States in terms of tax GDP ratios, much lower than Europe or Britain or Sweden or Germany or France. But at the same time, it is not just a set of rights, because in order to make these rights hold, you'd have to have changes in the economic arrangements. You can't have a right to food unless the food is being produced in the country. Now that basically would imply, in class terms, that you have to have a state that supports, sustains, promotes petty production, which is currently endangered by the encroachments of multinational capital. For if you do that, then of course you will have to have some delinking from globalization, because as I said, globalization enforces an identical program on everybody. If you wish to have a different program, then you would have to prevent capital flights of the kind that would undermine this, which means capital controls. If you have capital controls, then maybe some people might impose sanctions upon you, in which case you may wish to have trade controls, etc. But all of it would involve a degree of delinking, but fundamentally the idea would be that the petty producers who are under attack, and an attack that is often justified by invoking apparently some innate nature of capitalism, that it is going to absorb them, even if they are decimated as petty producers, it will absorb them as proletariat, which does not hold. Therefore, if we are thinking in terms of development that makes a difference to poverty, to the lives of people, then we have to defend these petty producers, think in terms of improving their resilience, their mode of organization through cooperatives and other such means. In other words, I'm not saying for a moment that we should forever, from now till time infinity, be stuck with petty production. But the point is that defending it must be the first step, and this, of course, has to then feed into the institutionalization of a set of basic economic rights. Not only do we need to defend our political rights, which are under attack, but we need to expand the range of rights and therefore strengthen democracy by moving into the realm of economic rights. That's the way that I would like to think of the present conjuncture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an interesting presentation on how unrestrained capitalism leads to absolute poverty and the need to redefine the rights by right to living and right to food and right to employment and so on. Next, to offer felicitations, I invite Dr. A.K. Prasad, Dean Faculty of Social Sciences and also our beloved teacher to the dais.
Respected Dr. N. Veeraman, our Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor M.A. Professor Prabhakar Patnaik, Dr. Manju Nair, and my dear participants. Today, the official beginning of entering the center and a 3-day international conference is formalized with the inaugural address by well-renowned social scientist Dr. M.A. Umman, followed by keynote address by Professor Prabhakar Patnaik, under the hegemony of our Pro-Vice Chancellor. I am very happy. For me, this is a memorable event because I am part and parcel of instituting inter-university center at the department. I think that it was in January 2014 that Government of Kerala sanctioned constituting an inter-university center under the Department of Economics of University of Kerala. Subsequently, I was asked by the Vice Chancellor to submit a detailed report regarding constituting inter-university center at the department. Since the idea behind instituting the center was conceived by Dr. Abdul Salim, I convened meeting of the teachers, and all of us decided to entrust the task of preparing the detailed report with Dr. Abdul Salim. Within a few months, he prepared a detailed report, and at every stage he consulted with me each aspect of the proposed inter-university center. By the end of May 2014, we submitted the report to the Vice Chancellor. Along with the report, the unanimous decision of Department Council that Dr. Abdul Salim be appointed as the Honorary Director of the Center, we submitted to the Vice Chancellor. Immediately after 1 or 2 weeks, orders came from the university constituting the inter-university center. Actually, the inter-university center aims to organize research, special lectures, seminars, especially on the areas in economics, which are really out of the mainstream economics. I am pretty sure that within the near future, the center is likely to become a separate independent institution having its own building, its own staff. I wish all success to the center. Then one more inauguration was also held here, 3-day international conference. The theme itself is the development question in a developing economy. Can strategies of past and present give a future? This is a very relevant theme. We are talking about the plans, strategies for development of the country, but there's a question: can strategies of past and present give a future? You think that before us a generation, an young generation is there. We have to ensure their safety and well-being. So this is a relevant question. We have to answer to this particular question. I think that 3 days won't do, but we have to give a remedy. In 7 sessions, eminent personalities will present the papers here. Very active discussions are expected. I think that all sessions will yield fruit, good results. I am going to conclude, I wish all success to both the IUC and seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As per the demand from the audience, they want an interactive session, or they want to ask few questions to both the presenters of the day. So I request the questions to be brief because we are running out of time. Those who want to shoot your questions can. First, I think Honorable DGP T.P. Senkumar IPS would like to ask the question.
Much less than the minimum wages, and there may be totally about 6 lakh, and actually employed may be about 2 lakh. But at the same time, in Kerala we see the phenomenon of about 25 to 30 lakh immigrant laborer coming, getting more than 3 times the minimum wage. How do you explain?
Let me first begin by telling you a story. When I first came here in 2006, we had done a lot of agitation for MGNREGS. In fact, me and some of my colleagues, we had gone and deposed before the parliamentary committee and so on in favor of MGNREGS, etc. And it had got enacted. It was a UPA left government, so we knew a lot of MPs who put pressure, etc. And when I came here, everybody told me, MGNREG is very good, but not for Kerala. Because in Kerala, you can't get a domestic servant, it's a labor shortage economy, there are people coming from outside, etc. When first, I think originally 2 districts in Kerala were eligible for this, Palakkad and Wayanad, yeah. And in each of them, about 80,000 people had registered for this. And everybody say, oh, you know, these are basically students registering because they think this is an easy way of get some money and so on. But as a matter of fact, we went to do those places. I think what is the case is that there is obviously in Kerala also a very significant problem of unemployment. But that problem of unemployment does not necessarily manifest itself in terms of the fact that people from those areas necessarily migrate outside. For instance, a lot of people involved in MGNREGS are women. I mean, there's a very substantial presence of women. Now, a woman employee is not going to kind of migrate somewhere else in order to get a job because she's unemployed, because she's located. I think what you're saying is a very interesting question. This question has been posed and it has been there, but on the other hand, I don't think it's because in Kerala there is actually for the local population at any rate full employment and therefore people are coming from outside, but on the contrary, I think it is actually a segmented labour market. The labour market is not one involving perfect mobility, it's a segmented labour market, but within the segmented labour market, there are segments in which unemployment exists, which is quite serious. And fishermen, it's very, I think fishermen would constitute a particular segment where they may not wish to go out of their, this is a phenomenon which has been noticed in many parts of the world, that people actually get lower than the wages which are available elsewhere. 2 reasons they don't go. One, of course, is straightforward economics in terms of probability, that if I give up my job and go elsewhere, what is the probability of my getting a job? Okay. In other words, the wage may be 50 rupees per day, or it's 300 rupees per day, while I'm getting 150 rupees per day. But if I migrate to the city, the probability of my getting a job is 1/3. Then the expected income I'll be getting is only 100 rupees, which is less than 150. So I don't migrate. That is one, the standard economics argument. But the other, as I said, is that there is also a resistance on the part of many, a social resistance to actually moving out and becoming a proletariat. People like Christopher Hill, who were discussing the English 17th century, 18th century England, they note this phenomenon, that the destitute don't necessarily wish to become workers, because when you're a worker, you're employed by somebody and there's a resistance to losing your freedom being employed by somebody while you want to stick to your traditional calling.
I have some more questions on that because
Yes.
MNRG, what is the asset creation, the productive employment, productivity. I am just, sir, Women sir, this is, as a student, I ask you one question only. When you have been asking for 38 years, so if you say mathematics and that how it should be reduced in economics, use of mathematics, how do you aggregate and how do you conceptualize? Because if you take economics in different terms, everything, then ultimately something common has to be devised. And how do you do without mathematics?
Oh, the answer is very simple.
See, my plea is not for throwing away mathematics. Nobody can do that. You cannot throw the baby away with the bathwater. This is not what I am trying to say. But to argue that mathematics is economics and you get Nobel Prize on the basis of that. This is a distortion, an epistemological tragedy. That should be corrected. Nobody can live without mathematics and arithmetic. It's not at all that. But I have said here, can botany, a book on botany, first chapter is on mathematics, and then start from there. Gerard Debreu's theory of value starts with mathematics. High mathematics is said there. But if you want to understand poverty, you formulate innumerable assumptions and then you come to a conclusion as part of your so-called positive economics. It may be predictable even, given the assumptions. But reality is far, far different from that. So it is a dangerous game to use mathematics as a substitute for economics. Economics is common sense made difficult, and mathematics is an instrument that makes common sense very difficult. There is a simple problem of provisioning and allocation. That is economics. It has mathematical implications. Nowhere on the earth can you do that. But if you want to create a science out of pseudo science in quotation, out of your understanding of economics, and in that respect you must read essays in Positive an old book by Milton Friedman. He convincingly argues for assumptions and predictions. Then you have to use mathematics. It's never, no sensible person, and I believe I am, will argue for throwing away mathematics. But to equate mathematics with economics is dangerous, misleading, and lead you and take you away from your own workaday reality and give the false impression, oh, here is a great professor. If I start here with equations, he's a clever fellow, he's an important man, he's an intellectual. But if I start about a village economy, how the village economy functions, how the artisan collects his raw material and works on that and creates things. It is different. Take the case of a tribal economy, which I narrated that story. It is not amenable to economics at all. The lives of the tribals here. Look at the tribal economy of Kerala, for that matter. What mathematics can you take it there? So, I want to elaborate.
There's a question here. In an era when robot economists and robot journalists are emerging, a gloomy future of unemployment awaits us. Can we remain Luddites and become technology averse? You know, let's be very clear about what we mean by unemployment. Suppose there is a world in which we don't have to labor at all. Okay. It would be a wonderful world if we can get incomes without laboring. Okay. The problem of unemployment becomes a problem only in an economy in which obtaining an income is linked to your being employed. Okay. But suppose you had a situation, in fact I visualize a socialist society in my view would be one in which getting an income should be quite independent of whether you're employed or not. Mind you, many capitalist economies are trying to do that, but you see what tends to typically happen, say in Germany, is that now in the context of the current crisis, they say, all right, there is going to be a 20% reduction in the working hours. If you can get a 20% reduction in working hours with getting no reduction in your wage rate or your wage income, perfect, that's very good. In fact, that's basically the idea of mankind's freedom. Then you have all your time available to write poetry or to whatever. So the problem with, I'm not a Luddite in the sense of that there should be no technological change. But I would say that we should build a society in which technological change must take place, but people's incomes do not get linked to their being employed.
So, one doubt regarding this labor, there were certain recommendations that was proposing certain changes or amendments to the existing acts of labor laws, which basically reduced the number of people that required, which basically increased the number of workers required for forming unions. So many acts that we see nowadays, which were really made for protecting the labor laws, are going against them. Which means that basically at the institutional level, we are going against the labor. Yeah, because if you want to have a strong union, you need to have a facilitating institution, but that is not happening. So how can we have this strong unionism? Because majority of our own institutions are trying to propagate this idea of homogenization of the labor. So is it possible for any society to support the unemployed classes or the informal to escape from this informalization of employment when you yourself are trying to get them out of the scene of development? That's the first question. And the second question is that not recently, in 2008, we had this diversity index put forward by the Amitabh Committee, which said that in order to make a public policy discourse to be effective, you need to maintain the diversity of the society and you need to quantify the diversity of the society by using axiomatization. So, at the institutional level itself, such increasing trends of axiomatization of sociological realities are happening. So, I just want to know that the institutions are trying to propagate this conventional ideas of policy making, which needs to be changed.
I have a problem in understanding your thing, because as far as I can see, today, one of the biggest problems is unionization of informal workers or unionization of temporary workers. In Maruti plant outside Delhi, an agitation has been going on for months. 150 workers have been arrested on murder charge, okay, because someone died in a clash and some of the workers didn't have anything to do with it, but it's a way of kind of smashing it. Today, any unionization, and what is the workers' demand? Workers' demand is to have a union whose members will be both the permanent as well as the casual workers, is being resisted. Okay. What is the labour market flexibility legislation which is being presented to Parliament? That anybody can be thrown out of employment, without any notice, which is basically making everybody into a casual worker. Maruti people, I hear from trade unionists associated with Maruti that in the old days you used to have factory gate meetings. Unions leaders would talk to the workers and so on. Today, if a casual worker is seen even accepting a leaflet, immediately next day he's sacked. Okay. Now, if you have labour market flexibility, then basically this would mean the death of unionization. So that is today's problem. The whole problem is quite apart from the fact that casualization anyway creates problems for unions. You actually have labour market flexibility. If that legislation is enacted, it will make trade unions virtually impossible. What is more, all over the world you find a very peculiar trait. You find that unionization is much higher in the public sector than in private sector. In America, unionization in the public sector, including education and so on, teachers, is about 33% of the workforce, whereas in the private sector is about 8%. One of the reasons why France has such militant unions is because in France still there is substantial public sector. Every privatization that is again a part of this whole globalization phenomenon is basically therefore making unionization that much more difficult. In the old days we had very powerful railway unions, 1974. But if the railways privatize bits and pieces of their operation, canteen, restaurant, etc., in that case those don't get unionized. So effectively then their own strength reduces, unionization reduces. To my mind, that is the real immediate concrete challenge as far as unionization of workers is concerned.
Due to lack of time, we entertain only one more question. I request you to be brief to the point.
Sir, my question is related to what you have said about diffusionism in your work, Retreat to End Freedom, and it says that diffusionism even cannot be restricted by the national level policies. Then where should we begin? You said that we should begin our anti-colonial struggle. We should begin from our anti-colonial struggle and put forward and way forward from there. So where should we begin if even a national policy or a nation cannot that restrict the capitalism's onslaught? Where should we start? Where should we begin?
Actually meant. My point is that if you have multinational capital is globalized, but you have nation states. Okay, if you have a nation state and and the economy is caught in this flow of globalized capital, then the capacity of the nation state to act gets undermined. If you are going to revive that capacity, and I believe such a revival is possible, if you are going to revive that capacity, then you have to delink from globalization. So delinking from globalization becomes necessary for reviving the capacity of the nation state to act in an autonomous manner. But that delinking is something which again has a kind of class basis, because after all, the strongest forces in favor of globalization are the corporate financial oligarchy, corporate financial interests. And consequently, if you are going to have a regime that actually promises what I was talking, he writes this, that and the other, then the classes that would have to resist it would have to be the classes like the workers, the peasants, the petty producers, the kind of, maybe some segments of the capitalism itself who may be getting squeezed because of this, free imports and so on. So the point is that, that between a state that is as it was slotted into globalization, where there is no autonomy, that's what I meant, and a state that actually wishes to acquire that autonomy by delinking from globalization between A and B, there has to be a different class basis of the state.
Thank you, professors, and thank you, audience, for posing your questions. The inaugural session is nearing its end. To propose the formal vote of thanks, may I invite respected head of the department and our guiding spirit and loving teacher, Dr. Manju S. Nair, to the dais.
Good afternoon, everybody, esteemed professors, learned dignitaries, friends, teachers, and students. The inaugural session of the International Conference on the Development Question in a Developing Economy is now over, and I am pretty sure that all of us now understand the need for analyzing economics and the question of development from an alternative perspective. And to chair this program, we had with us our Honorable Pro-Vice Chancellor, Dr. N. He is also the chairman of the Executive Council of the Inter-University Center for Alternative Economics. On behalf of all the participants and on behalf of the center, I would like to express our sincere thanks to our Honorable Pro-Vice Chancellor. Professor M. is a person whom we love and respect the most. And when we approached him for his consent towards inaugurating this program, he gave us a condition. You should be very serious in the seminar and the conference. And that is what Professor Uman is. He is very serious in his academics, he is very serious in his research, he is very serious in his speech that we saw here. He was just narrating the whole history of economics and the trajectory of economics from a developmental perspective. And we know he was, while he was being welcomed as a development economist, sir, you are a true development economist, not like the new gen development economists who use all empirics to prove that inequality will finally lead to development, or who proves that because of globalization there has been reduction in poverty. Now, that is not what we mean by development. And we have heard your very majestic speech where you have mentioned that can economics create a social order which will meet the need of each and everyone in the society? That means, can economics create a social order which is all inclusive? That is what development is. And we are very fortunate and we are very much blessed by our great professor who has inaugurated this function and also who has inaugurated this Inter-University Center with deep sense of love and respect. We would like to express our sincere thanks to Professor M. Prabhakar Patnaik, as we all know, is the person to whom we always look for alternative thoughts or alternative thinkings. And we people in Kerala I always say that an added sense of love and respect towards him because he was the vice chairman of the Kerala State Planning Board. Today he was speaking on the globalization and assault on democracy. Globalization has ingrained in itself the concept of inequalizing growth, whereas democracy has as its foundation equal society. Now, how these are becoming compatible, we don't know, and that is why he was speaking on the necessary for including economic right as a fundamental right, and how the economic system must be changed so that economic freedom becomes a fundamental right. Now, it was I understand that all our students benefited out of his talk, and it was a very, very beautiful speech on globalization and assault on democracy. So thank you so much, sir, for being a part of the center. He is a member of the external member of the Executive Council of the Inter-University Center, and it was he who framed the title also, the development question in a developing economy. So thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much from the bottom of our heart. Dr. Prasad is the Dean of Faculty of Social Sciences. He was the head of the department when this idea of the center was being framed, and he was there all along through the process of development of the center, framing the rules and regulations. You know how difficult it is to get things done in a formal manner, and he was there to guide us. So thank you so much, sir. And I would also like to express our thanks to our Director General of State Police, who had his open defense in economics 3 days back under Professor M.A. Uman, and we are very proud that DGP loves economics and takes it very seriously. So thanks to him also. And I express our thanks to Mridul Lipan Madam, former member of State Planning Board, who was here. This is how we understand how seriously people look into 3 alternative views in economics. So thank you, madam. And 2 other persons require very specific congratulations and thanks, and that is the director of our Inter-University Center for Alternative Economics, Professor Abdul Salim, and secondly, Mr. Siddiq, who is the coordinator of this seminar. I cannot express in words the effort that they have taken to organize this program, and also lots of programs in association with the center, the internships, the associateships, the projects, etc. 24/7 they are working behind this, and it's only for the development of the idea of alternative economics they are working, and please do understand the efforts that they are taking. And on behalf of our students, the department, I need not thank them, but anyway I should congratulate them for organizing. And to all other teachers who are here from the Department of Political Science, the Department of History, a lot of people are here, and research scholars from several other places are here. So thanks to all of you, and we always understand that the beauty of economics lies in the scope for alternatives, but we never teach our students the alternatives, we never read these alternatives, and we never understand the alternatives also. I hope that from now onwards we will truly understand the beauty of economics by thinking into the alternatives, and we will be able to adopt. I don't know how it is possible. I wanted to ask a question to Professor Uman sir also. Now, he had done this syllabus revision 3 decades back, but he failed, I know that. I have heard him explaining that, but now given the uniformity in syllabus that Indian universities follow, because people have to write civil service, Indian economic service, UGC, etc. I don't know how we are to incorporate all these things. Anyway, we'll find a solution to this, and let us hope that this conference will be a beginning for alternative developments in economics, alternative thinkings in economics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. The inaugural session has come to an end. We thank you all for your esteemed and active presence, and we look forward to seeing all of you in the following days of the seminar. We also like to thank all the dignitaries who came here and give terrific and wonderful speeches. Let's all stand up for the national anthem.
पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे.
Thank you once again. Have a very good evening.